You guys ready to get started? Cool. So just before we get started, I just want to get an idea who you guys are. So can you tell me a little bit about how many of you are developers in here? All right. Wow, that's great. How many are sales engineers? Anybody in that audience? No? So it's mostly developers? Got it. And how many of you have done any Android work, like created a Hello World app or something like that? Okay, a couple of you. Got it. Okay. So today's presentation is about Android at work. So basically I'm exploring some of the concerns and questions that typically enterprise customers have when it comes to Android. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So before we get started, I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Marco Garganta, and I have been doing Android training for a while. As a matter of fact, I was a developer of Maracana's Android Bootcamp a couple of years ago, and since then I've probably done bootcamp training for thousands of developers for companies such as Cisco, Motorola, DoD, Qualcomm, Sprint, etc. So I've been doing a lot of Android training. I'm also co-chair of Android Open Conference, which is a brand new conference we just launched this year. How many of you have been to Android Open? Anybody? A couple of you? Okay. So it's an O'Reilly conference that basically the idea is to cover the entire ecosystem of Android. So everything from app development to the actual platform development to the business of Android. So I was responsible for the content for the conference. In addition to that, I wrote a book. It's called Learning Android. It was published by O'Reilly earlier this year. And since then, it's been translated into German and Chinese. And I'm working on another book called Programming Honeycomb, which is really supposed to focus on programming the tablets, Android tablets. So intricacies that we deal with when it comes to programming for the tablets. I frequently speak at conferences. I've been at OSCON 3 times. This is actually my second time at Sprint Developer Conference. I was also a speaker at NDevCon, ACM, IEEE, and I'm a co-founder of a meetup in San Francisco called SF Android, which is a group of San Francisco developers that meet monthly and discuss basically issues that we're facing as developers when it comes to Android. So that's a little bit about myself. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of Android first, how we got where we got to, and then we're going to look at some of the concerns that we're facing when it comes to Android development in the enterprise. So as you guys know, Android's been growing fast. It's becoming one of the, it is the dominant platform when it comes to the smartphone market. But what's more interesting is that it's been growing really fast in the enterprise as well. So just to give you an idea, this is what we're looking at in terms of the growth for the data point is only 2009-2010 comparison. But the point is that we're seeing a humongous growth in the enterprise adoption. And that's what I really want to focus on. So there are reasons why Android is really good at the enterprise adoption. So before we get into the whole enterprise talk, I just want to discuss a little bit about versions, so you guys know what we're talking about. So these are the various versions of Android. Sounds like a lot of you, many of you are developers, so you probably understand that. I usually keep telling people that this version number is not that important. That this nickname is somewhat important, and when it comes to the development, this is probably the most important number that we care about. And as you guys know, we just recently got the ice cream sandwich as the latest release, which carries the API level 14. So that's where we're at in terms of just a little bit about the history of Android. These are the versions historically, just so you kind of understand how quickly things change and how quickly things get adopted. So currently, as you can see, Android 2.2 or 2x to be more precise is what the dominant platform is. So this is all 2.x, basically part of the pie. We have very little Android 3x, namely tablet version of Android adopted yet. So we're looking at just a couple of percentage points. And there's still some 1x versions lingering around. So the data points look like this. So as you can see, we're still in a single digit, a low single digit for the tablets. So that's the number that we're looking, those are the numbers that we're looking here, or more specifically these numbers. Over time, the adoption sort of happens, but it doesn't happen as quickly as we would like it to. to, partially because the OEMs are slow in releasing the latest drivers and versions of Android. So what that really means for us as developers is that we're often stuck with older versions as well. So as you can see, 2.3, for example, is rather quickly getting adopted, but we're still at more than 50% of the older versions out there as well. And we still have a certain number of 1X platforms lingering around. That partially has to do also with the fact that users tend to stick to their phones for a couple of years, just as a part of how it works in the US with the carriers. So in addition to regular Android versions, we also have third-party add-ons. It's almost impossible to get a phone nowadays that is a vanilla Android. So when you get a phone, you basically have an add-on for one of the third parties. HTC, Samsung, Motorola are all predominant players in that. And what they do is they customize the platform extensively. So beyond just adding a couple of graphics or apps, they actually end up doing a lot of deep down work in the platform itself. Just to give you an idea, the HTC development team is almost as big as the original Android team that works on the core Android project. So it's a pretty significant amount of manpower behind these customizations. And of course, we have with Google as an add-on there. So almost every consumer phone nowadays has the with Google a label on it, which really means that the carriers have done a deal with Google to license specific parts of Android technology that are proprietary. So in addition to just having the regular Android versions, we also have the proprietary Google stuff, and that usually includes things like Google Maps, unless you have Telenav, of course, includes Gtalk, Gmail, and things of that nature. So the point of about this is that this is proprietary stuff. So once you kind of get into the consumer land, the Android versions tend to be more of the stuck to the Google proprietary technology. So in terms of enterprise questions, one of the questions that I often see come up all the time is how secure is Android? Well, what do we know about Android security? And security means different things to different people. So I'm going to first explore it from the app level. So in Android, applications are sandboxed. What that really means is that each application lives in its own isolated environment. Just to give you an idea what that looks like is this would be a typical Android app process. What I mean by that is that basically at the bottom of it all, we have Linux process that runs on top of the platform. And inside of that Linux process, we have the Dalvik virtual machine. That's the virtual machine that runs all the Android apps. Now, on top of that virtual machine, we load any number of what I call the main building blocks. These are the things that make up an app. And those are activities, services, content providers, broadcast receivers, and such. You may also have certain data, such as native libraries, custom databases that are part of your project, some files that belong to your application, and of course resources, which are all things that are not code, such as graphics, movies, video clips, sound clips, etc., XML layouts, and so on. The point of this is that each app is highly sandboxed in its own sort of Linux process. So one application cannot access anything in another application's space. So from that point of view, that model is fairly secure. There's nothing that can actually break that. Now, every once in a while, you want one application to talk to another application. So to do that, we have the permission system. And basically, the way permission system works is if you have two applications, so application A, I'll put application A. So application A is requesting to use certain certain permissions. So it's actually asking the user to have the certain permissions granted to it. Application B is basically exposing those permissions. So if what the user is granted to use and what the application is providing matches like a yin and yang, we basically have the ability to have one application then directly talk to another application. So this activity, for example, could start this service. So that would be that's a model that basically allows us to grant certain permissions to a specific application. Now, the permissions are fairly granular, so you can basically fine-tune them based on various things, and user can, but the user needs to grant them. So the downside of this model is that basically user has to grant all permissions or no permission whatsoever, in which case the application doesn't even get installed. Right? So at the end of the day, the weak link is the user. Which brings us to the whole topic of social engineering. So although Android is engineered from the ground up to be a fairly secure platform, the problem is that the users are the weak link. Right? So we often download things from the market, from Android market, and we're just looking for instant gratification. We want to play that Angry Birds game. We're not really concerned too much about why it requires to read our SMS messages or read our contacts or connect to the internet, those sorts of things. Often those permissions don't make a lot of sense to users, and users tend to grant the permissions to the apps because they're looking to just test the app out. So that's the problem with social engineering aspect of Android security, and probably the biggest sort of challenge that we have in Android community right now. Like I said earlier, Android is based on Linux, which means that we're inheriting a lot of Linux features, Linux power, if you will, and that's a good thing because Android, unlike Blackberry, for example, doesn't trust security to the higher level Java space. It actually outsources it down to Linux, and Linux security is something that we know much more about, and it's something that we understand very well. Linux has been in harsh places over the years, has been tightened, and so we know quite a bit about that. So that's a very good thing about Linux. Now the problem with all that is that users tend to sometimes root or jailbreak their device. So what that really means is that the user is trying to install a different version of the operating system or modify the operating system to better fit their needs. So usually what I use as an example to explain what rooting really is we all have, most of us have company-issued laptops, right? And often those laptops you don't have administrative access to, right? You basically have just a sort of a limited user account, and the administrator of that laptop is usually your IT department. Okay, so it's a very similar situation in the mobile space. So as users, we have a device which we don't have administrative access or root access over, and the entity that does have the administrative access over our device is, in this case, our carrier. So Sprint would be essentially our IT department. So they don't want to give us full access to the device because if we mess something up, we're going to call for support. And so what users usually try to do is they try to fool the system and basically jailbreak the device and get their version of the operating system on it. That usually involves intercepting the boot process. And what that means is that basically it's kind of like on a laptop, you would press F1 or F2 and get into the BIOS, and you could pop in your CD and basically boot from your CD. So it's a very similar process on mobile. We basically try to intercept the boot process, pop in our CD. In this case, phones don't get CDs, but you can basically download something and put it on an SD card, and it serves essentially the same purpose, right? So basically, what we're trying to do to protect this is make sure that the bootloader, which is kind of like your CMOS on your laptop, is ensuring the authenticity of the operating system, right? So the bootloader tends to be the weak link, and some more advanced enterprise-grade devices tend to have the bootloader sort of check for the keys and verify the authenticity of an operating system. And those keys tend to not be kept in software, but even kept in hardware, in chips, so that you can't easily just figure out what the key is. So that's a little bit about bootlegging or basically stealing changing the operating system. Now, from Google's standpoint, although the focus has been the consumer and will be the consumer for a very long time, Google considers that they've been doing quite a bit in terms of
enabling the enterprise uses of Android. So this is a slide from actually from Google I/O, from the Android at Work talk that was given by their enterprise team. So basically, if you look at various versions, what we're seeing is that from version to version, there's been certain enterprise features baked into the platform. So what we have here is for Eclair, which is the 2x version, we basically have the secure Wi-Fi was added to the picture, VPN support, which we'll talk about later on, has been added to the platform, Exchange, and overlay for contacts. In Froyo, frozen yogurt, the significant thing that we got was the support for device policy management, which basically supports all these, right? So I'll talk about device policy management later on, but with device policy management, we can basically provision devices and manage a fleet of devices and handle the devices that are lost or stolen, etc. So that's a pretty significant new addition to Froyo. Gingerbread got us a couple of other things which don't really have a lot of security features, but do have some enterprise features, such as the ability to support priority inbox, SIP calling, NFC, calendaring, etc., etc. And Honeycomb 3x version of Android actually brought quite a few new features from security standpoint. Most notably, what we got is the ability to encrypt the entire hard drive. So basically, since Honeycomb, you can now provide the full disk encryption on the device. It does take a while, so it takes hours to actually encrypt a device, and it does provide a significant degradation in speed. So when you read from a device, or when your application is reading data, it's about 5 times slower than when it's just writing the data, when it's reading the data from an unencrypted device. So you do trade security in exchange for speed of or performance of your application. But that's something that is now available, and it's significantly enterprise grade. So that's a little bit about features that Google has been baking into various platforms. One thing to keep in mind is these are mostly APIs and so on. So often as an enterprise customer, there are quite a bit of work that you need to do to actually make a use of this. But the plumbing is there. So the actual infrastructure for a lot of these enterprise features is getting added to that. We don't have on this picture ice cream sandwich as the latest version, but there hasn't been anything really significant in terms of the enterprise features in the ice cream sandwich, so that's okay. Next, we're going to look at openness of Android. So when you consider different platforms, one of the key differentiators for Android is that it's open. So what does that really mean, and why would you care? So one thing that I often point out to is the vision for Android. So back in 2005, when Google purchased the little company in Palo Alto called Android Inc., a lot of people thought Google was going to get into the market for building a device. A lot of us predicted G-Phone, right? And at that time, Eric Schmidt, the boss of Google, came out and he basically said, look, our vision is not a single device. Our vision is to basically create a platform that's going to run on many, many different devices. So this statement is important because it trickles down into a lot of both business and technical things that subsequently have been addressed to accommodate for that. So both from technical standpoint and from business standpoint, it's really important because it explains a lot of decisions that they made subsequently. So when you look at openness of a platform, it's important to understand different licenses. It's not just, hey, do we have the is it open source or is it not open source? So open source licenses, there are many of them, there are hundreds of them. There are maybe a dozen or so that are sort of important. And out of all those that are sort of important, they boil down into 2 buckets, or at least that's how I kind of broke it down. So the key question is, does the derivative work fall under the same license or not? Okay. So keep in mind that, like I said before, the mission or the vision for Android is to create a platform that's going to run on many, many different devices. Well, that means that many, many other companies and developers are going to be involved in developing this. Well, that also means that if other people are spending their time and money extending this platform, they want to make sure that they can keep their intellectual property if they choose to, right? So what that really means is that you need a license that enables people to make changes to derived work and keep those changes, right? So that's back to the vision for Android. That's very important to enable companies like Cisco, Motorola, HTC, Intel, Qualcomm, etc., to actually spend engineering hours or invest engineering effort on the platform itself. So Android, for that reason, chooses that bucket of licenses, which basically boils down to the following licenses. It's either Apache 2, MIT, or BSD. Those are sort of the main representatives of that space of open source licenses. So you'll see that in Android, we basically try to keep everything in that realm as much as possible. Okay? So that's basically the goal. The other set of licenses falls under GPL or LGPL type of licenses, and that everything that is derived from those types of code requires you to give your derived work back to the community. In other words, license it under the same terms. And that doesn't work for enterprise customers who want to keep their secret sauce secret, right? So that's why we try to limit the amount of work that we are licensing under GPL or LGPL licenses. So with that, how does Android stack up? So this is basically the Android stack. This is the entire big picture of the operating system, right? We have apps at the top. We have, so these are applications. This is the frameworks, native libraries, and then Linux and drivers. So in terms of that, applications and framework are mostly licensed under Apache 2 license, meaning it's all open source, you can make changes to it, you get to keep your changes. You don't have to open it up to anyone else. The bottom part of the stack tends to be a mixed bag. So the native libraries, a lot of stuff here has been mostly copy-pasted from other open source projects. Okay. Now, when they did the copy-pasting or borrowing from other open source projects, they tried to also adhere to that licensing of MIT, BSD, or Apache 2. So we're mostly seeing those types of licenses in there. The Dalvik virtual machine is licensed under Apache 2, so it's very friendly. You can modify it, you can optimize it, do whatever you want with it, and you get to keep those changes. Now, the biggest sort of issue or challenge is the bottom part of the stack, Linux kernel, Linux space. And that's basically, we have two extremes in this space. We have, on one hand, we have proprietary drivers, right? Things that come from OEMs. For example, radio stack from HTC or GPS stack from Qualcomm and so on. Those things tend to be very proprietary and they tend to be very closed source. So we do not have access to that, okay? So that's sort of one extreme. The other extreme is Linux itself, the Linux kernel. Linux kernel is licensed under GPL, so which means any changes go back to the community, right? So we have, basically in this bottom part of the stack, we have on one hand overly closed source and then overly open source, right? Whereas everything else is sort of more of a middle ground. So that's a little bit about the licenses. Now, that's what Android stack looks like. What about Honeycomb? Honeycomb is so far not open source. We do not have open source for it. Initially, we were told that that the source code is going to come, that we just don't have it because they're too busy. And that was the initial statement. But according to Andy Rubin, the boss of Android project, nothing is really changed about the philosophy of Android. So it seems like there's no need for being concerned. But at the same time, although they said that the source code is going to become available, later on they changed that statement to it's never going to be available. So Honeycomb seems to be an exception more than a rule when it's all said and done. When you talk about being open, one of the things that it's important is the community leadership, right? So when we think of open source projects, we don't think just, hey, here's a source, you can actually see it, but we also think in terms of the community that drives what gets built into the project next, right? So usually open source projects are people coming together saying, hey, these are the features that we are looking for, and then essentially things would get done in terms of the, in terms of that priority. Android is different because Android doesn't really have a roadmap. Nobody really asked you what you would like to see in the next version. You can tell the Android team, but then they do have a list of feature requests, but they also have their own agenda. And most of us are not privy to that agenda. We don't really know what to expect until the big ta-na-na-na, here's the new version comes out, right? So it's a different beast when it comes to open source, the way we typically think about it. So no public roadmap. Another thing that also is kind of unique about Android project is the concept of bear hugging. Basically, picking the favorite OEMs for each release. So in the early days, it was HTC. Then after that, it was Samsung. Then it was Motorola. The word on the street was that LG was going to be next, but we're seeing Samsung again. So basically, the Android team picks a favorite OEM for each release. And it wasn't so much of a big deal before because all the members of the alliance, which I'll talk about later on, had access to the same source code and were able to innovate at the same time. But with Honeycomb, it was sort of different because Motorola basically had something like a 6-month lead time when it comes to developing for tablets, and that was the big deal for the tablet manufacturers, for OEMs. Apparently, this is not going to happen anymore, according to Andy, but at the same time, that statement was made before Google's proposed acquisition of Motorola Mobility. So we'll see what happens with that. So how does Android compare to other platforms? So if you kind of stack it up against iOS or Blackberry. So in terms of the adoption, we're seeing that the market space for the Android is, as most of us know, has really taken off. So we're right now in terms of the smartphone market. So we're not counting the feature phones like Nokia's and so on. Android has 43% of that market. So it's a pretty significant chunk of the market compared to iOS, compared to Blackberry and some other ones. Microsoft actually has slid down from 9% to 7%. So we'll see how the whole Nokia deal works out and if they reverse that trend. But in terms of the enterprise space, it looks like the Blackberry has basically lost the most of the market share. So as we know, Android is open, iOS is not. There's some fundamental differences going forward. In terms of features, they're going to be comparable. We can expect that. But in terms of the fundamental opportunities, they're going to be different just because iOS is a closed box, vertically integrated. It's always going to be more polished and it's going to be more of a complete solution. But when it comes to some interesting enterprise features, iOS is not going to be as open as Android, so it's not going to allow for as much of a customization as Android does. So closed box versus open system. BlackBerry has been suffering, like I said, probably the most. Their strategy hasn't been quite clear in terms of the tablet space. They had the rocky start. There were a couple of announcements about supporting Android apps on Playbook. It's unclear how that's exactly going to work. There's been mixed sort of announcements in terms of that. In some cases, they're going to run it inside of a sort of a virtual, almost a virtual environment. In other cases, they're going to recreate the entire Android stack on top of BlackBerry operating system. And the third option was actually to take Android apps, run them through some kind of process, and create more of a native BlackBerry app. But technically, that's not very clear how that's going to work and what the features behind that are. What's interesting is that enterprise aside, Android has also been something that the consumers are starting to desire more than iOS. So traditionally what we had is we had the iOS be the most desired operating system. But lately what we've seen is that Android actually is becoming something that the consumers actually want more than iPhone. And it's not just that they wanted iPhone, they can't afford it because it wasn't on Sprint, for example, a network, and now is, but they're actually desiring it more. So this is a Nielsen study, and as we can see, Android went from 26% to 31% in terms of desirableness, whereas iOS went from 33 to 30. So we're seeing sort of the trend reverse in terms of in favor of Android. So that's a good thing. So basically, all this stuff that we are baking into the platform is really good. It provides for a very solid foundation, but it's just that often. It's just a foundation. So what that really means is that a lot of other things still are left for the community to develop. And by the community, I mean third-party developers or companies that are sort of building solutions on top of it. So Google tends to provide the infrastructure pieces for the enterprise, but we're expecting third-party developers to actually provide things on top of that. So great plumbing. Now, another question that often comes from the enterprise standpoint is how do I connect my Android devices onto with a corporate network? In the context for this, before we get started, the context for this is that that you're going to have consumers bring their personal devices to the corporation. So basically, the way it works right now in corporate America, most of us have two phones, right? You have a company-issued Blackberry, often, and then you have your Android or iPhone device, right? So most of us carry two devices, right? One for business, one for personal use. And often, our personal device is way better, way more powerful than the company-issued one, right? And the IT department is pretty happy with this because they control that company-issued device. You as a consumer are not that happy because you would like to be able to check your work email on your iPhone or your Android device. Google's vision for the enterprise, and it's a vision that not a lot of IT managers agree with, but their vision is that there should be only one device, and it should be a personal device. So basically, we're seeing that a lot of development to make that possible. And I used to crisscross the country and talk to sales engineers, specifically for Sprint, and in certain places they would be like, no way, this is never going to happen. IT manager is never going to allow a personal device on a corporate network. But in other parts of the country, corporate IT departments are seeing this as an opportunity. They're basically saying, hey, this is kind of great. Like, I don't need to manage my own fleet of devices. I can just give 20, 30 bucks to my employees and they can, you know, I can subsidize their own personal phone on our network. So a lot of work has been going into making this possible, enabling this. So one of the big challenges, of course, is VPN, right? So if you remember that slide about features that have been baked into Android over time, well, VPN is something that was provided ever since Eclair. So ever since 2.0, Android provides VPN support, right? So that sounds great. However, the problem is that it's not any VPN that corporate America uses, right? So corporate America tends to use Cisco or Juniper or one of the main VPN providers. Android doesn't support them. Why not? Well, the reason why we don't have Cisco in Android is because Cisco is a licensed product, right? So if you were going to put it into the platform, then that would violate all the licensing, and Android would not be open source and freely downloadable, etc., etc. So the way around that is to basically not include proprietary stuff, but allow for an extension slot, where somebody else can actually license that technology, plug it in, and ship it off, right? And that's exactly what we're seeing happening with carriers and OEMs. So Sprint and some other carriers are starting to work with their OEM partners, like Motorola, for instance, and are starting to license the technology and basically plug it in and make it available to their enterprise customers. So architecturally the system is good, and we're seeing the enterprise customer, the carriers and OEMs take advantage of this for their enterprise customers. So that's basically what's happening with the VPN support. There's also a sort of a unique feature of Android that I kind of want to mention, and that's cloud-to-device messaging or enterprise push, which basically allows for an enterprise app server. So if you have an application that needs to send a message to a particular device, allows for an easy way to do that. So basically, Google has a infrastructure that is a Google proprietary cloud solution that you can use to notify your users, or so your application server can use to notify the server. Now, you may be concerned about security here, because how are we gonna, we're pushing this sort of proprietary enterprise sensitive data through a Google proprietary server, so that causes some concerns. But the point behind C2DM, as it's known, cloud-to-device messaging, is to only basically tickle your client's application. So basically just to provide a notification. So as such, you would never really push sensitive data through it, but you would rather just use it as a way to say, hey, there's something for you to go and check. So it's just a notification system or a tickle, more so than the actual routing of sensitive corporate data. So it provides for an enterprise push. Another question that comes up is, how do I manage a fleet of devices? I have all these devices out there that my employees are using, and especially if you're allowing employees to bring their personal devices to work. So how do you manage this? It could be hundreds, could be thousands of devices. So one thing that Android does provide is, since Froyo, is a device policy management API. So it's basically a new API that allows for creation of applications that can provide for secure administration of devices. So again, this is just an API, in other words, just plumbing that's baked into Android. You still need to develop applications on top of that. Oops. So a couple of things that we have as part of this framework is that we can provide for administration, such as enabling passwords. So you as an IT manager, you can set quality of passwords. You can set the length of passwords. You can set how many times the password can fail before the device gets notified to either get wiped out or something else. You can prompt for a new password. You can remotely wipe out the entire device, basically return it back to the factory reset mode. And you can also log the device so that nobody can log into the device. Right? So as such, it does provide for quite a few features, and it's powerful, but it's not extensive. There's still things missing on top of it. So and you still need applications that actually take advantage of that. Google provides one such application. It's called Google App Device Policy Manager, and it's available on the market. You can download it. The problem is that it doesn't work on all the devices or networks, so it's really at this point a hit or miss if this particular application is going to work on a device. Like I said, a lot of these things that we have are third-party solutions. A lot of things that Google provides is the plumbing, and we still need third-party solutions on top of that. So here's some of those solutions and kind of exploring what they look like. So one of them is a solution called 3LM, or 3 Laws of Mobility. 3LM is a company that it was basically a spin-off from, it had to do with a PhD project at Stanford that then spun out into Google, and then spun out into its own project, into its own company, 3LM, that was subsequently acquired by Motorola. And with the whole acquisition of Motorola, it may actually end up in Google again, so where it started. But basically, this is probably one of the strongest companies out there that are dealing with the enterprise-grade solution, and they're looking at things that are needed, everything from a full disk encryption to securing the connectivity to the network, to providing all those device policy management tools on top of your device. So remote wipe, password enforcement, backup, etc. So that's a little bit about 3LN and what they provide. This is just the architecture model of Sybase Afaria. So Sybase has a pretty mature product. They've developed it a while back, before, not specifically for Android. And what's interesting about it may not be that well known currently, but what's interesting about Afaria is that with the SAP acquisition of Sybase, this is going to become the enterprise solution for SAP customers. So that's why it has some teeth to it. It actually has quite a bit of potential to become a dominant platform for Android in terms of the corporate enterprise security as well. And then there's a product called Good Mobile, Good for Mobile from Good Technology, and it tends to be more of a sort of a secure island within an unsecure system. So basically, what we're seeing is that some third-party providers have this approach to providing security by providing one app or a sort of a federation of apps that provide security. So your device may be untrusted, but this particular app and its connectivity to the enterprise is trusted. And that's what we're seeing with Good. So basically they're saying, look, if you want to get your corporate email, corporate calendar, corporate documents, you got to log in within this app within your personal unsecured device. So that's another approach to providing enterprise solutions. So what apps are there? There are a gazillion apps on the market. Ultimately, as an enterprise customer, you ultimately care about providing productivity apps to make your users more productive. That's the goal of mobility in the enterprise in the first place. So what apps do we have out there? What's available? So there are many business apps, and it's really hit or miss right now. But if you go to the Android market, there are thousands of applications, and they provide everything from document management to backup to accessing your Exchange to reading your documents on the go, etc., etc. So there are quite a few applications, but right now it's really very much sort of a bazaar of applications. So it's a hit or miss. It doesn't help that Google is not really curating the marketplace that well. So it's really up to you as a manager to kind of evaluate these applications and trust the community in terms of what's good, what's not. But the apps are there, and the number of apps is growing. There's some other enterprise solutions, like I mentioned, that are more sort of a buy from us and you get a suite of apps. And we mentioned Good for Mobile, Sybase Afaria, Mobile Iron is another one. And the Google itself is actually doing a pretty good job. So for those of you who are running your businesses on Google Apps, solution, the paid solution, Google actually has a pretty decent set of applications. Everything from your Gmail to your corporate calendar to your Google Docs corporate version. So you can read your documents and edit your documents on the go on your tab and so on. So it's a pretty good example of how enterprise solutions for Android could evolve. So Google itself. Of course, you could build your own applications as well. So often you're going to have specific enterprise needs. You need that custom timesheet management or factoring application or something like that. So Android is a pretty good solution for that. A couple of reasons for that is that it's fairly easy to develop for Android. So it's Java-based. There are a lot of Java developers out there. They can quickly get up to speed. I know the market right now is tight for developers and it's hard to find them, but the fundamentals are there to actually have a decent supply of engineers who can help you with the development. So we're going to see this changing over time. Also, there's some solutions that enable easy development of applications even at the level of an IT manager. So Google has a product called App Inventor, which is basically sort of like your WYSIWYG drag and drop way of programming an application. It's sort of like, the Fox Pro of the was it 80s, 90s. So it makes it really easy to develop an application without actually having a computer science degree. App Inventor, speaking of App Inventor, it's been recently shut down as a project at Google, and it's been open sourced, and the new home is actually MIT Media Labs. So it's got a new home right now. So it's kind of uncertain what the future of it is, but so for now it seems to be safe. A couple of other rapid application development tools that I wanted to kind of mention. They fit sort of the same category. PhoneGap is one and Titanium is another. They basically allow you to build an app, a relatively simple app, in something like Dreamweaver. And so these are two separate products. PhoneGap more notably got acquired, or the company Nitobi that makes it recently got acquired by Adobe. So we're going to see PhoneGap actually tightly integrated into Adobe products such as the Dreamweaver. So it's going to become relatively easy for third-party non-programmers to develop simple custom apps for Android platform, and that's a good thing. So you develop apps. You got your apps, and these are your enterprise apps. How do you distribute them to your customers? Your customers is your workforce, right? So how do you get these apps to your workforce? There are a couple of ways. One of them is to put it on the market. So what you could do is you could load it up on the market or one of the other markets. And in the past, it used to be that I could just talk about this idea of multiple markets, but only really just point to one, and that's the Google's own Android market. So that's probably Google runs its own Android market, and that's probably the best known out of all the markets. But as such, it has certain issues, and mainly Google doesn't really do a lot to curate that market. So it's really anything goes in Android market. So you can upload an app. The next second, that app is available. It could be a tool, malware, spyware, virus, and that's okay. It's going to go up there, and it's going to stay up there until somebody reports it. And then you need a couple of those people to report it to actually have anything happen to it significantly. So essentially what's happening is Google is crowdsourcing quality of its market, or crowdsourcing the curation of its market. And that seems to be the big problem in the ecosystem. It's given Android sort of a bad name as the platform with the most viruses, etc. It's certainly not a good thing when you talk about enterprise customers and so on. But fundamentally, Android is an open ecosystem. So in other words, you can have many different markets. And for years, there wasn't really any big traction until recently we have Amazon as the big sort of force behind providing other apps. So that's a good thing. We're also seeing a lot of boutique markets. So a lot of companies are starting to create their own well-curated smaller shops, right? Cisco, for example, has its own enterprise market for its CS product, and T-Mobile has its own market for its consumer products, so does Verizon. So this is more from a consumer standpoint. Sprint is starting to curate apps that are more business specific as well. So there's a sort of like a better version of a market that gives you certain confidence about the apps because somebody actually went and checked them out, namely Sprint or some other carrier. In addition to markets, what you can do is with Android is you can simply what's called sideload an application, which basically means you can put up an app that you created for your workforce. You can put it up on your intranet site, and you can just send a link to people. Or you can just email it to your staff, and they can just download it, and it's going to get installed. So in other words, the distribution of applications is not limited to markets. It could be just sideloaded into devices as well. So that's a good thing in Android. One sort of stumbling block could be enabling the unknown sources on a device. So you have to basically allow for unknown sources to be enabled on a device for this to work well. You can also create a full-fledged enterprise directory. What that means is that you, as opposed to just sideloading an application from an internet site, you could create something like an Android market. It's private, right? So it's just for your enterprise. And we're seeing this happening with larger organizations. Their IT departments are a little more sophisticated, and the tooling to enable something like this is actually becoming more widespread. So it's relatively easy to create the market, put your apps up, and point your workforce to that particular market space. So that's a good thing as well. So another question that I also hear frequently from IT staff is, how do I lock down a device? So I have my devices, but I don't really want users to be able to just access the marketplace at all. I want to control this device much tighter and so forth. And when I talk about the locking down a device, this is beyond just provisioning a device with the device policy manager API that we talked about earlier, right? So the clean way of doing this would be to provide for policy management. So in other words, user can do anything, can download Angry Birds or Facebook for Android, but when it comes to the enterprise things, the IT controls the strength of a password, the locking down a device, the remote backup, wipe, etc. So that's sort of the device policy management API approach. What I'm talking about here is more of a rigorous lockdown of a device, often involves creating a custom image for your device. So speaking of the custom image, one approach that you can do on Android and you can't really do on any other operating system is you can create a custom ROM. And this is sort of a big deal for a lot of enterprise customers, right? Typically, just to draw an analogy with the PC world, your IT department doesn't just install Windows on your laptop. What they do is they create a custom version of Windows installation. It may be preloaded with Microsoft Office. It may be preset with certain company applications, and so forth and so forth. And they create sort of a gold master, right? The CD, and then they pop that CD into every single laptop, and that's how they install same image on every single laptop in the organization. Well, with Android, you can do the same thing. You can basically create a custom ROM, custom version of that Android operating system. Because Android is an open source platform, so in theory, this sounds great. There are a couple of problems with this. One of the problems is that it often requires special skills. Not a lot of people have those skills. So right now, the tools to do this are not available. But this is something that we're expecting is going to change in the near future. The other problem is when it comes to devices, remember the bottom layer of the stack tends to have some proprietary stuff, right? So the drivers, for instance, are proprietary. So although, yes, you can relatively easily create a custom image for Android on your computer, to get that custom image to run on a particular device, like Evo, for example, that requires to have some stuff from HTC that you may not be privy to, right? So that's why working with a carrier or OEM, but often with the carrier, tends to be the way to go, because they have those relationships and they can get that source code or those pieces that are missing at the very low level, most of the drivers. So that's one extreme that gives you sort of godly powers over the device, creating a custom ROM. The other extreme is third-party apps. So you could just download an app and call it a day, and that application could provide things like relative security. Now, apps by themselves are limited because remember we said earlier, apps tend to live in their own sandbox, right? So they can only do so much, so that they cannot damage the device or leak the data. Things like Lookout or Norton antivirus and so on, they basically are more of something that sits on top of your device, and it's a watchdog. It monitors what's going on. So based on that, it may do different things. So those third-party applications tend to be more of a just watchdog type of applications, and they don't, as such, they don't have a lot of teeth to them, but could be useful and are definitely much easier to just license and install and call it a day, basically with that. One question that also often comes up when it comes to the enterprise deployment is, well, what about the fragmentation of the marketplace? This is not as a bad word now than as it used to be, but it's still a pretty significant. It's probably one of the top 10 questions that I see come up. So what about the fragmentation of different devices that we have on the market? One solution to that is something called Compatibility Test Suite. So Android has had this thing ever since the get-go, ever since day one. We basically had a compatibility test suite. Not a lot of people knew about it, not a lot of people cared about it. So basically, if you want to be on a good terms with Google, you would make sure that your device adheres to compatibility test. Compatibility test is something that OEMs and carriers care about a lot. So basically, Sprint and HTC would need to run their device through this to make sure it adheres to what an Android device would look like. But then Android, if you put Android in certain other things that are not phone and don't really have anything to do with Google proprietary stuff, you may not care about this. There's a lot of talk about M2M, machine-to-machine communication. I've certainly worked on projects where we put Android in everything from home automation systems to cars, to set-top boxes, to satellites, things of that nature, even barges up in the North Pole, right? So those devices are proprietary embedded devices. They're on Android, but the makers of those devices don't care about, passing any CTS, and that's totally fine. Okay, they're just not going to be able to run Android market and are going to have certain other limitations. But what we're seeing recently is that Google is basically using this tool, CTS, to quote one of the higher up employees at Google, as a bat to hit the OEMs on the head and kind of force them in a certain behavior. And as such, it's getting a little more teeth to it than it used to have. For us as developers and consumers and so forth, CTS is interesting because it usually is a way to predict the future. Like I said before, we don't know what's coming out in the next version of Android. We're not privy to that, right? It's a private roadmap. However, to enable something, they have to have the devices capable of that. So CTS is usually going to require OEMs to build certain features well ahead of time, right, than it's needed. So NFC, near field communication, was one such example, right? Near field communication or NFC, as you guys may know about the Google Wallet, which is the Sprint. Sprint is a partner in that project. It's a solution where you can basically tap to pay at your Starbucks with your phone. Zero friction, you just tap and it's all processed behind the scenes. There's no pairing, there's no finding a network, there's no typing in a code, there's no barcode scanning, none of that. It's a very low friction. You tap and you pay, right? So that's what NFC or near field communication allows for. Well, NFC is an old technology. It's been around 5-7 years, something like that, but never really got anywhere. It didn't really get any traction. And what we're seeing is Google stepping in, using CTS as a way to basically force OEMs to build that chip into the device. Now, OEMs prior to that didn't really care about having NFC chip because consumers didn't care about NFC chip because nobody was taking the payments via NFC. So it's kind of like a catch-22. Nobody really wanted to support it because there was no users for it. So we're seeing Google basically break the catch-22 by using this tool as a muscle to muscle OEMs into certain behavior, i.e. putting the NFC chip into the devices and suddenly driving that adoption. So we went from 0 devices to like 16 devices or so on the market with NFC capabilities. So hopefully once we have the chip, we're going to have the apps and then we're going to have the vendors adopt the Google Wallet or similar solutions, and we're going to see this technology actually be useful for consumers. So what are some other concerns that we have in the enterprise? So these are some other things that I'm seeing come up. One of the concerns are the legal issues. So we're basically seeing, the legal landscape for Android be interesting, to say the least. And within that, you guys might have seen this picture before, but this is essentially who is suing whom. So the arrow points to the defendant, and so basically, if we take some of the more notable ones, so we can see that Apple is suing a lot of people. So is suing, for example, Motorola. Motorola is countersuing. Motorola and Microsoft are countersuing each other. HTC is being sued by Apple. Google is being sued by some small company that I've never heard of, and by Oracle over Java, which we already knew about. This is the dotted line means that it's been recently settled. So Qualcomm Nokia lawsuit's been recently settled. We're seeing Nokia be originator of a lot of lawsuits. It appears they don't have a lot else going on for them. So we're seeing that. We're also seeing Kodak, interestingly enough, being suing a lot of people. And then companies in gray, these are not real companies, these are basically patent holders, right? So Smartphone Technologies is one, nobody's suing them, they're just suing others. Sinclair IPC, Acacia Research, and so on. So these companies are merely patent trolls, right? So they're basically just suing other people over patent infringements. You may have seen a picture like that, and there are a couple of them going around, but that's basically what's going on, and that's one of the concerns in the Android ecosystem. Probably the best known one is the Oracle versus Google lawsuit. So what happened is, back in this has to do with Java. So back in the days of Sun creating Java, Google decided Google decided to use Java for Android, but it didn't use Sun's Java. It basically used Apache Harmony project, which is an open source Apache 2 license, friendly, open Java, right? In addition to that, Java is a language, it's free, and the tools are free, and a lot of other things in Java space are free, but one thing that's not is the virtual machine itself. So Android doesn't use the Java virtual machine. It created its own. It created a virtual machine called Dalvik. Now, it didn't originally create Dalvik because it wanted to bypass some kind of lawsuit or licensing or skip the money trap. But Dalvik was more created because they felt that they can optimize Java for mobile experience much more than Java was. So Java is sort of one-size-fits-all virtual machine, right? It runs from anything from tiny little computers like your Blackberries to all the way to the supercomputers, like big, massive web servers and web server farms. So as such, Java has been sort of, over the years, been more optimized over the web app development because that's where most of the Java deployment has been. When Google team or Android team started the project, they felt that if they just focus on mobile, they can do a better job. And so they developed Dalvik to be A, open source, but B, to be very well optimized for the chips that go into mobile devices. So as you know, most of our mobile phones run ARM-based chips, which tend to be much cooler. In other words, run on a lower temperature than Intel. So as such, use less power. So much better on battery. And battery is a big concern for mobile because batteries are not getting, they're getting better, but we're seeing an evolution, not a revolution in batteries, right? You're not going to have a nuclear fusion in your phone anytime soon, unfortunately. So Dalvik's been sort of optimized to adhere to the small form factor with batteries and so forth. So as such, it's basically a registry-based VM versus a stack-based VM and so forth. So everything's been nice, everything's been nice and dandy in Sun days. But then Oracle purchased Sun and with that Java and basically went after deep pockets, which is Google in this case, and they sued them for infringing on copyright laws actually over the APIs in Java. Most recently, judge has dismissed about 98% of those claims, but the lawsuit is still going, and it seems like it's a concern, but it doesn't seem to be a huge concern, so it's just something that I wanted to kind of mention. And of course, we have Apple suing a lot of other people as well over Android patents. So those are the legal issues. Another issue that is sort of emerging is the whole merger of Google and Motorola. A lot of people are not quite sure what to expect with that, right? OEMs are certainly uneasy about the whole merger. It's probably good. It's kind of questionable why Google is doing this. On one hand, it could be patents, but does it really make sense to be paying something like $38,000 per patent? A lot of these patents they don't care about. They really only care about 18 out of thousands of patents. So that's one question. The other question is, it's probably good for Google because it's going to create a reference device, right? So right now we kind of have the somewhat fragmented market with many different manufacturers. This may create a reference device easier and create more of a sort of Apple vertically integrated ecosystem as opposed to your Windows Intel sort of decoupled loosely integrated system ecosystem. So it's probably going to be good for consumers, and it's probably going to be good for Google and so on. The question is OEMs. They're, like I said, feeling uneasy about this. They don't know if it's going to be an unfair advantage to Motorola or not. Google says they're going to run the unit independently, so we'll see. A concern is also the Open Handset Alliance. So Google bought Android Inc. in 2005, but in 2007 they created an alliance called Open Handset Alliance and basically gave Android project to the alliance. So the alliance really owns the project, right? Sprint and Google and companies like that are members of this alliance. Now the alliance, although it has the power over Android, it's still very young sort of organization, so it doesn't have a lot of governing statutes and so on. So it doesn't have a lot of power yet. Members are still kind of learning to work together with one another. So that's something to keep an eye on, and so forth. Basically, it seems like that the source code becomes available to members of the alliance much earlier than anyone else. So there's some advantages to being a member, but what it entails being a member is unclear, and it seems that different companies get different treatment. So there was the documents were leaked in one of the lawsuits that was unrelated to Android, had to do with the Wi-Fi scanning in Massachusetts, and in some of those documents we basically got to see that Samsung and Motorola basically had different terms for the same membership roles in the alliance. So that's kind of how we get to know a little bit about what's going on behind the scenes. So the question is, what's really the motivation for Google to do all this, to create Android and to pay the bills of all these engineers, thousands of them, working on the next versions and so forth. So initially, in 2005, Google saw mobile as something that's going to explode, and at the same time, they saw mobile as a place where it's not really a level playing field. Google was successful in the web, where you sort of have, web is pretty open and based on open standards, and everyone can compete fairly. But mobile is not like that. You have carriers and you have OEMs that are all in the way. So you can't just do things your way. You have to play nicely with Sprint or Verizon or T-Mobile, as well as its HTC and Samsung and so on. And to kind of buy an insurance policy for the future, Google started Android project to basically give away this technology, this platform, hoping that it becomes an open standard for mobile, right? And it's been very successful at it, overly successful. And since then, it's kind of changed also into making money out of it by licensing technology and by doing different things such as mobile advertising and so on. So that's one way of where it started. When I was doing the research on kind of motivation for Google, came across a a document or blog post by Bill Gurley. He's a venture capitalist here in the Valley, and he basically quoted Warren Buffett, saying, Buffett basically says, when I look for a business, I look for a business with a strong economic castles that are surrounded with unbreachable moats. In other words, you want something that makes money, and you want barriers to entry so nobody else can really compete with you on that. Google still makes 95% plus of its revenue from a single product, and that's search, right? So that's the castle for Google. And the moat is anything that comes in between the actual user doing the search and the actual Google servers that provides the search, right? So on the web, that would be the browser, right? But when you look at the mobile, well, you have the carrier and you have the OEM. They can all decide against Google, for example, right? So that's one of the other reasons for Android project and the whole support for that. So that's another way to kind of understand why they're doing what they're doing. So, so with that, that's basically all I had in terms of the official stuff. From the enterprise standpoint, Android is a solid enterprise platform. So it does provide for a lot of features that we need to roll out enterprise solutions, and but a lot of stuff is missing. So again, it's really the plumbing that we have, and we now need to build things on top of that plumbing to enable the actual applications that we need for the enterprise use. So with that, we have plenty of time for questions, and I kind of wanted to open up to see what you guys are dealing with and what kind of questions, comments, concerns you have. Yeah.
Is there any way to add a custom driver to Android and expose it through it and still be able to get through Google processes?
So is there a way to add custom driver and expose it through to enable Google license?
To a custom API. So you have a custom driver for the API.
Yeah. So to kind of bring up the we had a picture of the stack before, and basically what you're looking at is adding something to the lower level here. And yes, you can do that. And that doesn't mean that you're going to break a CTS. You're quite welcome to extend or expand the platform. You may have certain new feature, maybe support for HDMI interface or support for second screen or God knows what, right? So that's totally fine. Yes, you can add a feature. You can also provide, so if you provide a driver here, you would want to provide a library to support that, because in Android, the driver model is actually based on loading a shared object, an SO. So it's not based on typical Linux reading from a /dev device driver. So you would want to provide an SO library here. Then you would also want to wrap that elegantly into a Java API. So you would basically provide a Java API to that. So at this point, you would have something here so that your applications can now access that. So yes, you can absolutely do that. There's a right way to do that, and to basically provide that as an add-on and an extension to doing that. Google Maps would be an example of that. So it doesn't really use a driver, but it's an entire vertical slice. So everything from providing the application framework piece to providing native libraries piece, and in this case, it doesn't provide the drivers, but a lot of other solutions do that. Yeah. So absolutely possible and doable. Other questions? Yeah.
You had touched on permissions a little bit previously, and then there's all the well-known permissions, camera, internet. But is it also possible to make your own custom permissions?
Yes.
Comment on how that works.
Yeah. So the question is about custom permissions. Yes, you can easily create your custom permissions. You can bake them into the ROM, so you can actually make them available as part of the platform. You can also provide enforcement of those permissions. So there's a place on if you're actually baking it into a ROM, it needs to go into /system/permissions, and it's an XML file that defines what the permission is. Usually, like I said before, in Android, the permissions map to the low-level Linux UIDs and GIDs. So you need to, there's a file, there's a .h file that specifies that. So you need to actually provide the mapping from a high-level permission in Android to the low-level Linux GID. Because ultimately the way it's enforced, the permissions in Android are enforced by kernel. So the kernel basically checks, does this app belong to a certain group? It's a standard Linux way of checking stuff, right? And that's good because that's very simple and it's very sturdy. We know a lot about it. So now just the question is, how do you assign a GID to an app? And that works through Android permissions. So the permission that user grants to an application is then mapped to the GID. Does that answer it?
I guess someone, maybe to make a more concrete example on it, say I make my own camera app, and I don't want any other app, I don't want other applications to just be able to call into it and be in the intent. So I want that app to have a special permission, so like Android permissions, Android definition, that special camera. How do I keep, is there a way to be a permissions system to keep other applications from just locking on?
Yes, there is a way, and I actually have that all spelled out in a document, how to do it, how to build custom permissions. So if you want your simulator, and I'll provide you with that. But there's exactly the way we have an example. We do this Android internals class, and basically what we do in the class is we build one of those vertical slices all the way from a top level application to the middle layer, to the library layer, down to the kernel system calls, right? So we build one of those custom things, and as part of that, we also build custom UIDs and GIDs and assign custom permissions. So we have sort of the recipe how to do exactly that. So I'll be happy to share that with you. Yeah. It's very technical. So yeah, yeah.
So if enterprise want to disable certain applications that come with the system, right? Like Marshall, whatever it is, is there any way to do that with the like DLL, or there is another way?
So if an enterprise wants to disable
The camera, for example.
So if an enterprise wants to disable a camera or something like that, back to the device policy management. Device policy management is somewhat limited. It can only do certain things, such as enable pass. It's got about 6 things it can do, like length of password, age of password. If you require locking, screen locking, wiping device, and so on. So it's got only like half a dozen or so policies. You may want other policies like disabling a camera, and that's a pretty common one in the enterprise. You just don't want camera to be enabled on a device. Sometimes it's camera or network sometimes for whatever reasons. And that's something that is not provided by the device policy management. Now, why isn't it provided? Why is there just a half a dozen policies? Policies, unlike permissions, need to be enforced very low level into the code. So just coming up with a policy is easy. You could come up with a policy, camera not allowed. That's easy. Enforcing that policy requires a surgery to the operating system. Okay, so that's harder. Now, with a custom ROM, you can certainly do that sort of stuff. And it doesn't have to be, it's not a hard customization of a ROM. There is actually a INI file that specifies specifically for camera, is it allowed or disallowed. So in other words, it's a fairly straightforward change to the source tree to turn that flag on or off. But it requires creating a custom ROM, flashing a device, blah, blah. And that could be a harder one to do. Keep in mind, Google's vision for the enterprise is really to keep users doing what users do. So they don't want you to disable users' camera, right? So that's not really within their vision, but they want to enable user to securely access the enterprise. So it's still going to be sort of like a user device with an enterprise ability inside of it versus the other way around, enterprise taking over the device. And that's why it's a little tougher on the camera. But having said all that, you could create your custom ROM, and then you're God, you can do whatever you want. But that's a lot to work, possibly. Yeah, so hopefully that answers.
Is TLM expands that with the APIs?
Do they what?
TLM expands the capabilities?
Does 3LM expanded capabilities? Not that I know about camera. I'm not 100% sure about camera.
So that wasn't.
Yeah, so 3LM, is, as far as I know, is still built on top of the standard APIs. So they provide, they basically provide the actual solutions on top of that plumbing. So, but they had a lot to do with the plumbing itself, so they understand it very well. Yeah. So the question is basically to work with the to work with the OEMs to support the enterprise features, right? Like Samsung and Motorola and so on, right? Yes. Yeah, so what we're seeing, yeah, so the question is really about the extensions that you know, OEMs provide. And what we're seeing is that certain OEMs are starting to kind of focus on certain aspects. So everyone's basically with Android, everyone is starting at a much higher level. So in the past, you know, HTC would have to build their own OS or something, right? Now everyone's kind of starting with Android, right? So what that means is that the innovation is now happening at a much higher level. And what we're seeing is that each OEM wants to provide something extra, make their platform be interesting, unique, different, and so on. HTC focuses on consumers. So their whole thing is to focus on making everything look sexier, nicer on Android. And they're very good at that. Motorola traditionally had that focus as well. Was all about the consumer social aspects of usage. But lately what we're seeing is that Motorola is actually taking the lead in the enterprise adoption. And what that means is they are now enabling certain features like expanding their platform with Cisco VPN, things of that nature, right? So that's certainly happening. They usually provide you with the API so that you as a developer can develop apps that will now only work on Motorola devices. So that's a good thing because it doesn't really require you to do anything with them. You just need to buy their phone and, you know, develop an app for it, and you can take advantage of those APIs. When it comes to you want something to do something different and get them to change how their API works, you need to be really big to get their interest. So typically, you know, 10,000 units plus at minimum to even like start talking to you. Then again, it really depends on a carrier and so on. Motorola has Motorola Solutions, which is a little easier than mobility when it comes to custom stuff, but it's still very, very custom. HTC or Samsung, they're like looking at much larger orders to even, you know, even consider making any specific changes. So, does that answer your question a little bit? Yeah.
I wonder if you could discuss any details of possibly developing a secure app and app with possibly running on a UICC card, or what people trust us for using, what partners you have to deal with to get something like that running on a SIM card.
So developing an app. So the question is about developing an app that runs on a SIM card.
Well, we have an app, we have also developed a Java card app. To get your Java, your app running on a SIM card, they want the 65 chip. So they run their app on the 65.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I don't know about that particular thing. So I don't know what their approach is going to be about, you know, requiring the specific SIM cards or Java running on them at all. My understanding was that it's pretty open, that you don't really, that it doesn't really require anything other than NFC capability on a device. Yeah. Well, so what aspect of a secure element is there? Because oh, okay. So it's outside of the Android space in that case, right? I don't really know much about that. But that would be for the reader, for the device that the consumer is interacting with, not for the phone itself. Yeah, I don't know much about that. Other questions? Questions, comments? Cool. Okay, well, thank you guys. Hopefully learned something new about enterprise use of Android. And if you have any questions, I'll stick around, so just ask me afterwards.